All-in-One Company looks forward to seeing you at Matt's in March.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
President Trump fulfilled a campaign promise on Tuesday, imposing blanket 25% tariffs on imported goods from Canada and Mexico, while also doubling the rate on China. Economists have some serious concerns about the impact the tariffs might have. Jason Miller of Michigan State University joins us to put the latest developments into context. When is a crash preventable and when is it not? It's something that can have a big impact on your safety score. I'll talk with David Grimes and Alex Clark of CDL Legal. And finally, 5 states are considering programs to either use weigh-in-motion scales or to increase funding for weigh stations, while yet other states look at changes in weight rules for trucks. Scott Thompson gets the latest from our state legislative expert, Keith Goebel. And now, here's Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. You've likely seen the news by now. President Trump imposing blanket 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods as promised, and hiking the tariff for Chinese imports from 10% up to 20%. We had a lot of questions about what this might mean for the American economy, the supply chain, and more, so we reached out to Jason Miller for some help understanding what's going on. Jason is an associate professor of supply chain management and the interim chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University's Eli Broad College of Business, and he joins us on the line now. We spoke with you, it was almost a month ago when this was all mostly just talk. We didn't quite know where things were going, what was going to happen. Now the tariffs have been put into effect, as we all know. Just your immediate reaction to what we've seen here.
You know, honestly, my biggest reaction really is shock. I thought, a little bit like, most market commentators did, that the tariff discourse, especially with Canada and Mexico, was really much more political rhetoric and attempts for negotiation. I did not think they would actually be put in place, given, sort of widespread recognition amongst the economic community about how detrimental this will be, not only to the U.S., but also, again, Canada and Mexico.
Yeah, and the last time we talked to you, again, it was all kind of a hypothetical. We didn't know where we were headed. You at the time expressed some very real concerns, if the tariffs were to go into effect, some very real concerns about the effects of that on a whole lot of people and a whole lot of sectors. What concerns you in the very near future, and when we're in the early stages of this, obviously, but in the near future, the short term, what concerns you the most?
So to me, the biggest concern is what's going to happen to U.S. production of motor vehicles and parts, which is obviously a key sector for the freight market. If you look right now, we've been seeing some very troubling data points over the last 6 months from the U.S. motor vehicle sector. Production on a seasonally adjusted basis is down about 10% from where it was in the first half of 2024. Payrolls have been decreasing. They're now below 1 million. They had been as high as about 1.025 million just about 8 or 9 months ago. And so this is a sector that is very exposed to cross-border trade. From my understanding of the tariffs that have been put in effect, there's no duty drawback, which means that imagine you're a Michigan manufacturer, and let's say you're the second stage of a 3-stage process for producing a certain part. Let's say the first stage is done in Canada. You import that stage 1 product, you refine it more in your stage 2 position, and then you export it back to a different Canadian firm that does the stage 3 production, and then it comes back to Detroit for final assembly. Normally, you would get what's called a duty drawback on that. So in other words, you pay the tariff on the stage 1 import, but then you get that money back. And so at the end of the day, you only have tariffs effectively being applied one time on that good, and it would be when that stage 3 good comes into the United States. But now it appears that we're going to have what I call tariff pyramiding, and that the tariffs get applied when stage 1 comes in, And then they get applied when stage 3 comes in. And so you have a much larger tariff that takes place. And so we're very worried about, what this is going to do to, the price of vehicles. Some of the estimates are saying, $10,000 more expensive for the consumer. And, quite frankly, motor vehicle prices are still up 20% from before the pandemic. There's no real way for them to go down where dealer margins are at. And so my biggest concern sort of over the next couple months is, people start buying fewer vehicles, and that means less steel, less auto parts, less freight, and we all kind of know how that plays out.
Yeah, and we can – I don't think we need to get too far down the line either, because I'm not sure what we know. We don't know how long these tariffs are going to be in effect. As we've talked about, the president is sort of looking for concessions here. With that in mind, and I am no expert, you are, and I know that you speak with other experts in this field and other economists, and they've been kind of flashing that red light for a while now. Anytime this topic comes up, expressing concerns, saying that this would not be good for the economy, especially at the point that we are right now. I'm not going to ask you to get into the president's head here, but I think there is some, obviously a negotiating tactic going on here. But do we have any sense of why the Trump administration is pushing ahead with this plan despite all these concerns that are out there? And again, the concerns are being expressed in very, very strong ways. What's the motive here?
So my personal belief, and this is just looking at the rhetoric that has always surrounded the 2019 economy, as we all know in the freight space, 2019 was not a good year. It was a weak year for manufacturing output. It was a weak year for freight rates. I mean, we were in a freight recession. However, the entire U.S. economy, unemployment was declining and inflation was low. So my personal belief is that some of the advisors around the president and the president himself do not interpret the 2018-2019 tariffs with China as having negative repercussions for the economy because they're so glued to those two specific economic measures, unemployment rate and the inflation rate. And because of that, it's resulting in sort of a narrow hyperfixation. And I just don't think that the feedback on the 18-19 tariffs with China were fully recognized. And to be clear, we are now way beyond what those tariffs ever were. And so I think that's part of it. I do believe that there is a fundamental misunderstanding amongst some groups of economists that are pro-tariff about the realities of global supply chains. When you look at the assumptions they make in their models, they're completely unrealistic. And so unfortunately, you have sort of simplified economic reality that says, hey, maybe there is an optimal tariff rate that is fairly high, when in reality, that optimal tariff rate is probably near zero, given the structure of today's global production network.
We'll leave it there for a moment, but much more from Jason Miller of Michigan State University after the break, when we'll get into the best case scenario for what happens next, the effect we're likely to see within the supply chain over the coming days, weeks, and months, and more. But for now, back to you, Mark.
Thanks, Scott. Next, we'll continue Scott's interview with Jason Miller of Michigan State University's Eli Broad College of Business about the tariff situation. I'll discuss preventable and non-preventable crashes and how they affect your safety score with David Grimes and Alex Clark of CDL Legal, and we'll hear what states are doing about truck weights, scales, and more from our state legislative expert, Keith Goebel. We'll be right back. I'm Mark Rettig, and this is Landline Now.
Protect your diesel engine with Howe's Diesel Defender. Restore vital lubricity, eliminate injector deposits, and boost fuel economy by 5% or more. Power, performance, protection, all in one. Howe's Diesel Defender, available now.
Firestone's FD694 drive tire for long-haul and regional applications now delivers 126,000 more removal miles than the Yokohama TY517 MC2. Contact your Firestone commercial dealer to learn more.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
Landline Now, welcome back. Earlier in the show, we started our conversation with Jason Miller of Michigan State University's Eli Broad College of Business about the new 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico that went into effect on Tuesday. We're going to pick up that conversation now where we left off by talking about the last time we saw similar tariffs put into effect back in the fall of 2018 during the first Trump administration. Those tariffs were narrowly focused on China. This new round of tariffs is much wider in scale, meaning the effects are likely to be much greater, and that's where we'll pick things up.
Another difference this time around, and please do correct me if I'm wrong here, but we saw retaliatory tariffs immediately from Canada and Mexico. We did not see that last time, and obviously this is much bigger in scale than the 2019 tariffs were. But the effect of that is going to be felt quite a bit as well, right?
Yeah, so what happened last time was Canada, Mexico, everybody essentially retaliated against the U.S. for the metal tariffs on steel and aluminum. And then China retaliated fairly broad-based against the U.S., especially starting in the latter months of 2018. We've already seen China, the first tranche of 10% additional tariffs, they did not hit U.S. agriculture. They now have, so they've put tariffs on U.S. soybeans, which is the last thing farmers need right now because Mexico is the biggest buyer of U.S. corn. And so we have the ag sector getting hit. Canada's going to start tariffing a bunch of stuff. Mexico's already indicated they'll release on Sunday what they're going to start tariffing. But the key thing is this exposes different U.S. manufacturing sectors to tariffs in a way that did not happen with China. So, for example, auto parts, we don't export auto parts to China effectively. We export tens of billions of dollars of auto parts to Mexico and Canada, and those may get hit with tariffs.
I see some pushback out there when people call this a trade war, and maybe it's too early to call it that, I guess. Is it fair to call it a trade war at this point?
I think unless something changes very quickly, and the thing is this is, from everything we understand, the opening salvos. The president put out on Truth Social last night, he's looking at tariffing agricultural imports from the world. We've got metal tariffs going into effect for steel and aluminum and a wider range of goods. The 12th of this month, there's ongoing discussion that we're going to have tariffs with the EU, and that one's going to be a major loggerhead because the Europeans and essentially the rest of the world, the U.S. is the outlier here, apply something called value-added taxing, which every decent economist will tell you value-added taxing does not discriminate against exports from other countries, but the president has gotten it in his mind that it does, and Europe's not going to change how they do taxation. And so we're likely to see major tariffs with the EU, which that gets interesting because the EU's biggest export to the United States is pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
And that's one category we haven't really talked much about yet.
Last time we talked to you, I'm paraphrasing here, but you essentially said that, I suppose you could be wrong on a few of these things. You don't know for sure, and nobody knows for sure, if we're being honest here. Obviously, we have evidence to kind of back up some of these claims, but we're talking a lot of negatives here and a lot of the concerns. We obviously know where you stand, and those concerns are very real. The opposite argument that we're hearing out there, the one the president is making, I suppose if you were to play devil's advocate against yourself here, what is the best case scenario for what we're seeing and where this may be headed?
So the best case scenario is somehow all of these tariffs result in, one, a dramatic reshoring of U.S. manufacturing. There's no evidence that this will happen. So that's one of those, if somebody says it's a benefit, I chuckle a little bit because there's no evidence for it. And so it's basically trying to pull a benefit out of the effort. The other thing would be somehow this allows for renegotiated trade agreements that are substantially better for the United States than current trade agreements. again, I think the irony is the U.S., if it goes to bat against any single country or trade bloc one at a time, the U.S. wins in this conversation. The problem is we seem to be wanting to take on the whole world at the same time. And that puts us in a much weaker position than if, say, we targeted China for unfair trade practices, which do exist, but went about it from a multilateral standpoint. We would be in a very good position there. We are in a worse position negotiating with China by also picking fights with Canada and Mexico at the same time. And so, there's just frankly very little good to see out of this. And we even saw this with ISM's new order data for February. We saw substantial weakening from where the momentum had been at just a couple months before. And so, I think you're already seeing purchasing managers saying, hey, this is not looking good for the U.S. manufacturing sector.
You spoke earlier about what we're all going to see as consumers. You mentioned vehicle prices potentially going up. I think $10,000 is kind of the number that I've seen out there. Produce, there's a whole bunch of goods that are likely going to go up in price here the longer this goes on. For truck drivers out there, that aside, the prices aside, with regard to the supply chain and their everyday lives, their livelihoods, we talked about this a bit last time, but what's going to look different here over the coming days, weeks, months?
So I'm expecting we could see maybe a little bit of disruption at the border as we're having to, get tariffs collected. Probably the biggest thing a lot of trucking companies are facing is, we buy a lot of Class 8 vehicles from Mexico. And so those are suddenly going to become substantially more expensive as a result. I do think that this is going to be it's going to disrupt freight networks, and that, we're going to see some companies are going to gain business from this. Some companies are going to lose business from this. And so my guess is there's more loss than gain. But this is going to cause some disruption of freight networks as sourcing patterns shift. So that could be something actually from a carrier standpoint that is good, because disruption means trucks are, essentially the more that you may have some lanes seeing more demand than expected, you get higher tender rejections, more freight on the spot market. But that's going to be counterbalanced by a general loss of freight as this plays out. So what I would say right now is, if you're a trucking company, you now need to start sort of planning for one of those not good case scenarios for how 2025 could work out compared to certainly where I was at in late November, early December, when, my writings were quite bullish on the sector because we had a lot of tailwinds going into 25. The problem is the tariffs are just this massive headwind. And, quite frankly, when I was doing most of my 2025, sort of forecasting, I didn't think this would happen because I just couldn't see an economic reason to go into a trade war with our two closest neighbors, whom we export over $400 billion of goods to each year.
Yeah. And, honestly, it's possible that by the end of this week, the tariffs are withdrawn, the president gets some concessions, and we're kind of back where we were. My question with that is, if that were to happen, in a couple days, few days, whatever it may be, would things bounce back pretty quickly? At that point, things would not have changed that much, I would assume, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
If somehow this gets resolved very quickly with Canada and Mexico, yes, certainly. That's not as much of an impact. And then, the situation with China, that does not benefit U.S. manufacturers, but it's not nearly as detrimental. And then we're going to be stuck waiting on the conversations about, autos, pharma, et cetera. I mean, the potential for a global tariff on motor vehicles, that would be incredibly disruptive, because even if the Canada-Mexico tariffs go off, if you reimpose them on the auto sector for Canada and Mexico, you get the biggest share of the economic hardship. that we're going to experience because of the outsized role those two sectors, or that sector plays with those two countries. And so even then, we're not really out of the woods yet. I do think the fact these tariffs went into place, it will create such uncertainty about trade policy that you will see a reduction in planned capital investment this year. I think the very fact these tariffs were allowed to go into effect is going to make a lot of folks very concerned about, hey, do we really want to spend $30 million on new equipment?
Certainly a lot to digest, and a lot of this is coming at us pretty fast. I could talk to you all day about this and ask you a ton of questions, but I think we covered pretty much all the bases here. Any final thoughts about any of this, about what we're seeing? Advice, you gave some advice to folks out there listening, but just final thoughts on everything we're seeing.
Right now, again, it's very fluid. We will see how this plays out. And, just to give folks perspective for why this matters, especially for our exports, is Mexico, Canada, and China represent about 7.6% of all the value of shipments from U.S. manufacturing plants. And on average, about 18% of the value of shipments from U.S. manufacturing plants are exported, and that's to the world. And so when you start thinking about why this matters, is, from a domestic U.S. standpoint, as you start seeing substantial reductions in U.S. exports, that means that there's going to be less freight to be moving. And so even, this is the other thing, is to the extent this is putting strains on trade relations and hurts U.S. exports, that is not a good thing for trucking companies that we're banking, certainly on 2025 being a much better year than 2024.
Yeah, that is discouraging to hear, for sure. And I'm sure a lot of people hearing this will be discouraged. But, there is a case to be made, I guess, for the opposite side of this, too. And there are economists out there. I guess I should ask you this. Are there economists out there who are pushing back on some of the things that you're talking about here? And do they hold any water for you? There's a small school of economists that focus on something called optimal tariff theory that is purely an analytical exercise. There's no empirical data to really back this up. It would support much higher tariff rates. Stephen Myron, who's in the president's close orbit as part of the Council of Economic Advisors, I believe he may be the head of it, is one of these folks, but unfortunately he's not this is going to show my elitism, but he's not a practicing academic tenured economist, so he's not, in my eyes, a real researcher. Gotcha.
And so I'm just very skeptical. When you look at all the empirical research done on the 2018-2019 tariffs, there's not been one that has shown that they were essentially effective at generating manufacturing output in the U.S., as an example.
We will see what happens. Professor Miller, we appreciate it, as always, and we may pull you in again here in the near future, depending on what happens out there. It seems like something new every day. So thank you for your time. We do appreciate it.
Yep, you're welcome. Take care.
Our thanks once again to Jason Miller, Associate Professor of Supply Chain Management and the Interim Chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management at Michigan State University's Eli Broad College of Business, for his time and his expertise on this complicated matter. We will, of course, keep an eye on both the short and long-term effects of the tariffs and keep you posted. For now, though, we'll take a quick break. I'm Scott Thompson, and you're listening to Landline Now.
Dispatch, I picked up that load of steel, so I'm ready to roll.
Sounds good. Remember, we're getting paid by weight, so make sure to use a cat scale.
I wouldn't weigh anywhere else.
Forget misaccuracy when you truck on a cat scale.
Penske is the trusted source for quality used trucks. Whether you search our website, call our sales staff, or bid at our online auction, you are sure to find the right used truck for your business. Visit PenskeUsedTrucks.com to view our inventory and learn more.
Landline Now. Welcome back. When is a crash preventable and when is it not? It's not just an academic question, because how the FMCSA rates that crash can have a huge impact on you, your life, and your operation. In August of 2017, the FMCSA started to review crashes submitted by truck and bus companies to determine whether the crashes could have been prevented. 2 years later, the agency proposed making that program permanent, and in late 2024, the agency expanded the types of crashes covered. To discuss what that expansion entailed, as well as some other topics, I talked with David Grimes and Alex Clark of CDL Legal. Well, guys, FMCSA has come out with new guidelines for non-preventable crashes, and I thought we might want to start with what were the previous guidelines? What kind of crashes were listed as non-preventable before this change?
So there was a really strict list about non-preventable. And when we're talking about non-preventability, what the DOT defines as non-preventability is a very short list of very specific types of crashes. Not what we would think of like, oh, I wasn't at fault. That guy like merged weird and ran into me, or he pulled out, and I couldn't have seen him because he was in my blind spot. All of those determinations of who's at fault or what was going on, those are usually done for the purposes of insurance and possibly a ticket. But this non-preventability program that the DOT has is all geared towards adjusting the carrier safety score when a truck is involved. And so they have these very specific guidelines. The old guidelines, like I said, were very strict, and they had to do with if there was something like a motorist who didn't stop in traffic or blew through a light, if there was a motorist who crossed all the way into oncoming traffic. And I say all the way because if one tire was still over that double line, it did not count. If a driver was drunk and you could prove it, not just, oh, they seemed drunk or they admitted that they were drunk, but if there was a test that was given at the time, things like that.
Now, they have made these changes, and we should note for folks, these have been in place for a little while now, I guess a few months. What has been added or changed within those guidelines now?
Well, you said that they have been in place for a few months, and what's important about that is that any crashes that happened since the beginning of last December 2024, are eligible for these new expanded definitions. Any crashes that happened before December of last year, anything November 2024 and before that, are not eligible. So that's where they drew the line. But these new ones may seem kind of innocuous or maybe obvious, but they weren't there before. And the FMCSA was getting a ton of negative feedback from carriers and from drivers saying, hey, like this really should count as non-preventable. There was nothing my driver could do about this. There are only 4 of them. And the 4 additions are the CMV was struck on the side by a motorist operating in the same direction. This is usually a bad merge. Somebody is coming across, not looking where they're going, and they hit the truck somewhere along the length of the truck. The second one is the CMV was struck because a motorist was entering the roadway from a private driveway or parking lot. So believe it or not, that wasn't covered before. If you were coming and someone was coming in the opposite direction from a road and they hit you, okay. But if they were coming out of a parking lot, it didn't count. Number 3 is that CMV was struck because another motorist lost control of their vehicle. So there were specific definitions in the in the prior list for reasons that they might have lost control. But this is more general and just covers. It doesn't require as much burden of proof. And then the last one is actually all about burden of proof. It says any other type of crash involving a CMV where video demonstrates the sequence of events of the crash. So this is one of those instances where people were saying, hey, I have video showing that this should qualify for non-preventability. But what the FMCSA was saying prior to this change is we only accept what we see on the police accident report. So people were saying, well, a police officer shows up 10 minutes later. He makes an assessment based on what he sees and what he thinks is what happened. But I have video that shows that this happened instead. How can I prove that to you, FMCSA? And so that's why they made this change, is they wanted to expand that a little bit and give these drivers this outlet, and the carriers the outlet to say, hey, I do have proof. It is legitimate. Here's what it shows.
Well, that seems like a lot of common sense, but especially that last one. So if you went to FMCSA with video before, they might not make any adjustments in your safety score because of that, right?
That's absolutely right, and it is a huge win for carriers to have this outlet now. It's definitely one of those steps that we've been wanting to see for a long time. So just know, again, it only applies to crashes that happened from the beginning of December 2024 forward. So if there's an older crash that you're like, oh, finally, now I can come back and tell that FMCSA guy where to put it because I've got this video that I can show him now. No, I'm sorry, you can't. It has to be those more recent ones. But now going forward, all the carriers and the drivers have this outlet and these expanded definitions that they can use to get some relief on their safety score.
So I'm wondering if you can walk us briefly through the process. When you talk about getting these listed as non-preventable, it's not automatic. You've got to go to FMCSA. What's the procedure you have to follow in order to get that listed that way?
Yeah. So you're still going to want a copy of the police accident report and video if you have it. And you're going to want to look at the list of definitions. You can Google, non-preventable crashes, FMCSA, and you should be able to pull up a list of all the different definitions. And if you think that what you have in the police accident report or the video fits into one of those definitions, then you can go on the FMCSA's data queue portal, which, again, if you just Google data queue, anyone can have access to it. You have to sign up for a little account, but it's free. Everyone has access. And follow the steps, put in your information, and send it off. Now, crash data queues do take a really long time to process, sometimes up to 3 months. So it's not something that happens very quickly. But someone at the DOT will review your data queue challenge about the crash. And if they think that it does fit the non-preventability, then they'll make that change. But like you said, Mark, it doesn't happen automatically. No one can do this for you. Crashes will always come onto your score as preventable, which is the worst version of points and impact on your score. You have to go make that change.
It's interesting because we've talked a lot on the program about dash cams, and I've noticed now in looking at videos online that you have people that have not just the forward-facing, but also ones that look behind the vehicle to see what's happening back there. This really kind of makes the case for the utility of those, to the importance of having them.
Yeah, absolutely. We joke a little bit around the office that if we were all behind the wheels of trucks, knowing what we do and sort of seeing the legal knots that people get into, that we would have 16 cameras on every truck that we drove. Because, it's just there's so much that can be gained by having evidence yourself. Now, there's a lot of kind of legal back and forth as to how much recording is too much, and maybe you can get into trouble, but that's another topic. I would say that now that drivers have this ability to present camera footage in their defense, then yes, definitely have that forward-facing camera and a backward-facing camera if you can.
Let's go on to another topic here, and that has to do with the various statuses that you have on your electronic logs. And some folks are having trouble in terms of how things need to be categorized, especially, as you noted in the note that you sent me, the difference between off-duty and sleeper berth. And before we get into that, weren't ELDs supposed to fix all this?
Well, Mark, there's an old saying, garbage in, garbage out. For computers, and I put plenty of garbage in my computer at times. But the point is that they still have to make designations, and they still need to understand what those designations are. And the biggest misunderstanding is between sleeper berth and off duty. So sleeper berth is specifically when you're resting. When you don't have to necessarily be sleeping, but if your cab is equipped with, it's a condo, it's equipped with a sleeper berth, then you need to be in that place in the truck when you're saying you're in sleeper berth. So if the guy pulls you over and it says sleeper berth on your ELD and you're driving the truck, or even a co-driver sitting beside the driver, we've seen that, that, you think you're resting, but DOT, FMCSA does not think you're resting when you're doing that. So that's one real, that's a very important distinction. You must be in that sleeper berth. You can watch TV, you can read books, you can do all that kind of stuff. Plus you need at least 7 hours of sleeper berth. You can, and then on the other side of that, you can be in off duty. Off duty is when you're completely relieved, kind of like sleeper berth, but you're not sleeping, but you're out of the truck. You're going to play basketball. You're going to eat. You're going to run errands, things like that. But the key though is if you're going to do that, this mild version of split is you need 3 hours consecutively. I believe, of at least three hours of off duty to pair with the sleeper berth, to 7 hours of sleeper berth.
I've always understood it that when you split the sleeper berth, that both of the periods you split have to be in the sleeper berth, that you can have some on-duty time between those two periods, but you do have to be in the sleeper berth on that second part, don't you?
Right. I'm not actually talking about the split sleeper berth. I've just been splitting it up. Yeah. Okay. I'm not going there this time. If you guys want to understand sleeper berth, go to a reputable source and look at the charts and the graphs and the page after page after page explaining it. Can't do that here. What I mean is you can, to satisfy the 10-hour rule, you can use either 7 or 8 hours of sleeper berth, and then at least 2 or 3 hours, depending, to make that 10 in off duty.
Okay.
And off duty, you can't be fueling, you can't be, doing any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, nothing that advances the business of the motor carrier.
Right. And if you do take the truck to go somewhere, in that using, PC, personal conveyance, you cannot be advancing that truck to the, you gotta either go someplace and go back, or make sure you're not moving forward toward and end up closer to your destination.
Yeah, and I think the main thing to think about when you talk about the ELDs and these various statuses is the only thing the ELD can really tell is the truck is moving, the truck is not. After that, it depends on you.
That's a good point.
Okay. Well, guys, we've run out of time here. I know there's a lot more we could talk about on this topic, but thank you very much for the information.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
I've been talking with David Grimes and Alex Clark of CDL Legal, a legal services provider for the trucking industry, about the addition of more kinds of wrecks that are now included in the non-preventable accident program at FMCSA. We'll be back in just a moment with more news and information. Please stay with us through a short commercial break. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
At Truck Stop, we built a better load board for carriers like you. Sign up today and access over 600,000 loads on the most trusted online load board. Learn why the best in the business rely on Truck Stop to make more money and start driving your profit today.
Capital Reman, the leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, has partnered with OOIDA to offer exclusive member benefits. Visit capitalreman.com today to support America's transportation industry and take advantage of your benefits.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com, because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Welcome back, everyone. Scott Thompson here in Studio A, joined by Keith Goebel of Landline Magazine, which usually means we're about to get a rundown on moves on the state level related to trucking. Keith, good to see you.
Scott, I think it's fair to say that that's what we always talk about. At least
Always
on air.
99.9% of the time.
Yeah.
Off air, it's usually baseball or football or something else.
Something to that effect.
All right, we'll stick to trucking today. You've been doing quite a bit of work of late on weigh-in-motion programs, the growing number of states that are considering them in particular. This is one of those things that has been trending of late, it feels like, starting with, I think, New York, right, a couple years back.
Yeah, going back to 2023, they touted their first-in-the-nation truck weight enforcement rule. Specifically, the focus was on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, setting a program up there to deal with an issue that they've had through the years, and obviously that particular expressway, very challenging to, maybe potentially pull someone over if they're suspected of being in violation. So to them, it was natural to take advantage of the weigh-in-motion devices, and from there, the topic has it's continued to have some discussion this year. There's more activity at the state houses that are looking to do something very similar to what New York has done, again, with these weigh-in-motion devices.
Yeah, and we see this a lot. When you have one state that puts something into effect, other states take notice and they sort of follow the lead there. And I think that's what we're seeing here with a number of states. We can kind of run through a couple of them here, starting with not too far from New York. In fact, a neighboring state, New Jersey, is looking at this right now, and pretty all-encompassing what they're looking at doing there.
Well, in New Jersey, they do have weigh-in-motion sites on various types of roadway. What this new legislation, the Senate bill, would do, it would establish a program like that for bridges that are categorized as being poor on the National Bridge Inventory, wanting to add it to those specific locations. This bill has had some discussion already. The Senate committee that it was in, they put a amendment in there that would clarify that there wouldn't be a violation unless the vehicle exceeds a weight threshold by more than 5%. Obviously, one of the concerns being, and something that OOIDA has talked about, is specifically, I know Doug Morris with OOIDA had mentioned that the weights that are measured by these devices, they do not fall within the scientific weight tolerances or standards. So a bit of a concern there. You see in New Jersey with this legislation, again, adding that weight tolerance, looking really to address that very concern.
Yeah, and that's a very big concern. As you mentioned, OIDA has talked about that more than a few times, and they talk about this every time this conversation pops up again. And it's something we're going to hear more about, obviously, as these states consider this. We mentioned New Jersey there. I know another state looking at this, also in the Northeast, Connecticut, is another state looking at this potentially right now, and they've had some discussions already within the State House there.
Yeah, they had a transportation committee met recently. Got some input, not favorable for the legislation.
Okay.
Even though, I believe it was the bill sponsor there had said, if we do this, if we adopt, or expand the weigh-in-motion systems there in the state, that it would provide a more stable revenue source. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, we see where you're coming from there. But among the concerns that were voiced during that same hearing in the Connecticut DOT, they pointed out that because they would be responsible for this, they had pointed out that they would need additional funding in order to accomplish the intent of the bill, which is not included in the legislation. There's nothing in there about funding for doing that. And again, as you would expect, the Motor Transportation Association there in Connecticut said that these devices aren't accurate enough to be used for direct enforcement. So, yes, I don't know if that legislation is going to see the light of day outside of the committee. But again, yeah, it's definitely up for discussion.
Proof that we don't just talk about baseball and football when the mics are turned off. We were talking before this about Connecticut in particular, and there's another bill that kind of caught your eye, I guess that's in the Transportation Committee there, that isn't necessarily weigh-in-motion related, but does have a weigh station corollary there.
Yeah. This particular bill would just flat out, it would prohibit police from assessing fines against a truck driver when weigh stations are closed. So the focus here is on offenses, I guess if you wanted to call it that. Like if a truck is parked on the shoulder and they're operating an overweight truck, if the weigh station is closed and they can't go in and do their business there, they shouldn't be fining the drivers for that, for sitting again like on the side of a highway. So yeah, it is interesting. That is something that haven't really seen addressed, but does make a lot of sense.
There you go. Alabama, Arizona, Oklahoma also considering weigh-in-motion programs, changes, and the like. You can go to landline.media for updates on those if you are interested. Separate but somewhat related here, Keith, we've got a few, more than a few, I guess, states considering changes to weight rules. We're not going to get to all of these either, but efforts in a few states did stand out to me, including Minnesota, where there's a bill that would increase the weight limit across the board in the state.
Yeah, I mean, that is the issue of truck weights is always a topic at state houses. I mean, you see efforts that they focus on a particular commodity, allowing them to be heavier. And then on occasion, you see states, like in this particular case with Minnesota, that it's essentially across the board. But I guess even with Minnesota, you would say, well, okay, so maybe it wouldn't apply to everybody, but it is definitely something worth highlighting. This particular bill, for gross weight of all axles of any load, they would increase it to 108,000 pounds with this legislation. Now, those affected trucks, if they were authorized to haul up to 108,000 pounds, they still would be required to comply with like bridge load limits. It wouldn't just be they'd just have free reign of state. There would still be some rules in place there to try to prevent further damage to infrastructure.
Yeah, you talk about concerns with weigh-in-motion programs. OIDA has concerns about this in terms of wear and tear on roadways and other concerns there as well. So we may hear about that too. But another state, this one's interesting, I thought too, Iowa. They're actually calling on the U.S. Congress, right, to change federal law to allow for higher maximum weight limits, I guess, not just in their state, but everywhere.
Yeah, on occasion you'll see a state legislature where there is a resolution that's been offered up. And essentially, I mean, this is non-binding. It's just essentially to let, in this particular case, Congress know that if this were to pass in Iowa, that they would support this particular move. And specifically, it's a move to permit on interstates loads up to 96,000 pounds with 7 axles. So looking to address really some of the largest trucks there, not only in the state, but across the country.
And before we go here, we don't have a whole lot of time, but natural gas, electric battery-powered truck weights, that's also being considered, I guess, elsewhere too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've seen here for the past 10 years since Congress adopted allowing for natural gas, electric battery-powered trucks up to 82,000 pounds. We've seen states through the years kind of do it piecemeal, as you would expect. You get 50 states. There are some states that authorize electric-powered trucks up to 82,000 pounds, but they don't for natural gas-powered trucks, and vice versa in some states. South Carolina's got legislation to kind of move in that direction. Illinois, Iowa, and Texas, to my knowledge at this point. But looking for heavier truck authorization again for those alternative fuel trucks.
We'll keep an eye on it, Keith. We appreciate your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
That was Keith Goebel of Landline Magazine closing things out for us today. We thank you for joining us. We do appreciate it, and also appreciate all you do to keep this country moving. Until next time, take care and drive safe.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife,
I'm a writer,
photographer,
I farm,
I'm a veteran,
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
Chrome, and I am
a
professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us! Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit ooida.com.